I want to say right out of the gate, this is a bit of an odd episode. When we wrapped up our breakdown of episode 2 of Fear and Loathing in the New Jerusalem, the miniseries from Darryl Cooper's Martyr Made podcast, we had just completed a deep dive into events unfolding at the end of World War I. We left off around 1921-1922 amid a surge in violence in the region, including the Nebi Musa riots and Tel Hai raid in 1920 and the Jaffa riots in 1921. The Paris Peace Conference had concluded in early 1920, and former Ottoman territories in the Middle East had been carved up between the British and French through the Mandate system. So going into episode 3, I expected us to make some progress, perhaps into the late 1920s, early 30s, but surprisingly, we don't get there. Don't get me wrong, there's definitely some history to cover, or maybe I should say some ahistoricity, but a lot of this episode leans more towards sociology than anything else. By that I mean Cooper takes us on an esoteric deep dive into the evolution of states and the impact that process has on individuals, families, and communities. He also explores the distinctions between advanced states and tribal societies. And just a reminder, I'm not skipping ahead, so I don't know what comes after this episode, not yet. And I'm taking in this series one installment at a time, so I haven't yet reached the coup de grace that explains all this sociological buildup, but we'll get into why I think he's spending so much time on it shortly, and we'll see if I'm right. So with that said, if you're okay with a bit of sociology with history, or if you just want to make sure you have all the context heading into our next episode, keep listening. We open episode 3 of Fear and Loathing in the New Jerusalem by backtracking a bit, as Cooper takes us back to 1914 with a focus on the Hashemites, the prominent Arab family we discussed earlier that ruled the Hejaz, the western coastal region of what is now Saudi Arabia. As a quick refresher, the Ottomans delegated local authority to influential families they believed they could trust. Think of it as outsourcing governance to keep the empire running on a local level. Not an easy task in the early 1900s when controlling everything directly from Istanbul was impractical. It was also a surefire way to ensure loyalty and maintain oversight over the empire's distant provinces. If your paycheck and social standing depend on serving the empire, you're probably going to ask how low you need to bow to keep those in power happy. And the Hashemites, like many other families, played that game. But things start to shift in the early 1900s, 1908 specifically, with a political shakeup known as the Young Turk Revolution. The best way to frame this is in Western terms. Think of the Magna Carta, when the English king was forced to accept limits on his power. And just like the Magna Carta clipped the wings of the English monarchy, the 1908 revolution was intended to restrict the Sultan's power. He could no longer rule unilaterally, at least in theory, with new checks and balances put in place. In practice, however, power shifted from the Sultan to a political group known as the Committee of Union and Progress, or CUP, led by 3 men known as the 3 Pashas, Talat Pasha, Enver Pasha, and Jamal Pasha. They weren't related. Pasha was just an Ottoman title. With the rise of the CUP, things began to change quickly. They aimed to centralize authority and claw back the autonomy of local notables like the Hashemites. They started installing their own officials across the empire, which the old elites saw as a direct threat to their turf. Sharif Hussein of Mecca, the head of the Hashemite family, didn't take kindly to any of this. Remember, the Hashemites controlled the Hejaz, home to Islam's 2 holiest cities, Mecca and Medina. That brought with it immense prestige and influence. So as Sharif Hussein watches this unfold, he grows increasingly uneasy. He sees the writing on the wall. Istanbul is coming for what his family has safeguarded and benefited from for centuries. All of this context matters because of how Cooper frames the Great Arab Revolt, which was launched by Sharif Hussein and his sons against the Ottomans in partnership with the British. He says the British, quote, induced the Hashemite clan to rise up in rebellion against the Ottoman Empire, end quote. We touched on this briefly in an earlier episode. The Hashemites actually approached the British first when exploring an alliance. given their strained relationship with Istanbul, it's clear this wasn't just some clever British maneuver. The Hashemites feared they were about to be cast aside. In fact, historian and Iraqi politician Ali Alawi wrote a well-regarded biography in 2014 titled Faisal I of Iraq. It tells the story of Emir Faisal, Hussein's son, who played a key role in this era of Middle Eastern history and was famously advised by Lawrence of Arabia during the Great Arab Revolt. Let's dig deeper into what Alawi says about Hashemite motivations, because I think Cooper's framing here is off. He implies that the Hashemites were hustled into supporting the British, but in reality, they were already weighing hostilities against the Ottomans on their own. Alawi writes that around 1914, two of Hussein's sons had begun reaching out to the British. Quote, behind the scenes, Hussein and Abdullah had started to make contact with the British in Egypt, seeking allies where they could find them in case another confrontation erupted with the CUP. End quote. He adds that Abdullah, one of Hussein's sons, was sent separately to meet with the British. Quote, Abdullah was instructed by his father to sound out Kitchener regarding the position of the British if the CUP moved to depose Hussein. End quote. Kitchener was the British commander in the region, for context. Alawi continues, quote, as usual, he, Abdullah, passed through Egypt where he met with Ronald Storrs, Kitchener's Oriental secretary. Storrs stressed the official British position of non-interference in the affairs of a friendly power, and an unwillingness to aid the Arabs of the Hejaz in case of a revolt. End quote. Bear in mind, this is happening before the Ottomans officially enter World War I. And if you're thinking at this point that maybe Hussein and the Hashemites were being a bit paranoid, just wait. One of Hussein's other sons, Ali, actually intercepts some documents that made their way from the CUP over in Istanbul, and they are quite damning. Quote, a trove of documents fell into the hands of Sharif Ali on the march towards Medina. These revealed a series of secret correspondence between Wahib Pasha and the CUP leadership, which discussed the assassination of Sharif Hussein and his sons and the suppression of the Hejaz's special status in the empire. End quote. So even before the Ottomans entered the war, in October 1914, the Hashemites were already sounding things out with the British because they sensed the axe might fall at any moment. The idea that the Hashemites were just a blank slate the British manipulated doesn't hold up. They were trying to protect themselves just as much as the British were trying to win the war when they decided to join forces against the Ottomans in 1916. Cooper continues with a claim we've done a deep dive on before, when he says, quote, the British are making contradictory promises regarding the same stretches of Arab territory to all sorts of people, end quote. We're not going to rehash too much of that debate here. If you want a granular breakdown, go back and listen to the earlier episodes of this manufactured Martyr miniseries. But suffice it to say, as we've discussed, those promises weren't as contradictory as Cooper makes them out to be. As we've covered, everyone on the British side at the time and afterward acknowledged that the Hashemites were never promised any territory west of the Jordan. That means that the Balfour Declaration, which promised the Jews a national home in Palestine, didn't actually conflict with the McMahon-Hussein correspondence, where the British made territorial promises to the Arabs. Now, a stronger case can be made that the Sykes-Picot Agreement conflicted with the McMahon-Hussein letters, since France was promised influence over Syria and Lebanon. But even then, here's where things stood by the early 1920s. Hussein retained control over the Hejaz. Abdullah was given Transjordan in 1921, and Faisal, his other son, signed an agreement with France in January 1920, in which the French acknowledged and supported an Arab state in Syria. Yes, Abdullah was initially a British vassal, and Faisal would have been the same under the French if he hadn't violated the agreement he made with them by accepting the Syrian National Congress's proclamation of him as king. But for a family, the Hashemites, that started with just the coastal region of Western Arabia, this was a remarkable outcome. Their territory had effectively doubled overnight, and to this day Jordan still remains under Hashemite control. So when Cooper says the promises were contradictory, there's some truth to that, but the idea that the Hashemites got totally screwed by the British, I'm not buying it. They gained real power and land. And if Faisal had played the diplomatic game like Abdullah did, keeping the French on side and convincing his people that this arrangement was only temporary, like Abdullah had the foresight to do, we might be looking at a world today with both a Hashemite Syria and a Hashemite Jordan. But hey, I guess we'll never know. Around this time, Faisal entered into an agreement with Chaim Weizmann, who was then the president of the World Zionist Organization. Signed in January 1919, the agreement stated that Faisal would support Jewish immigration to Palestine and that both parties would cooperate in implementing the Balfour Declaration of 1917, the British pledge to establish a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. The whole idea behind this arrangement was that Faisal knew he was in a bit of a precarious position between the British and the French, and he thought that if he got the Zionists on side and played nice with them, that they would support his efforts to maintain control of Syria, and in exchange, he would support the Balfour Declaration. It was, in essence, a bit of a trade. Some realpolitik, wheeling and dealing. You scratch my back, and I'll scratch yours, if you get my drift. Cooper draws attention to the end of this agreement between Weizmann and Faisal, and much of the lengthy sociological analysis that follows in this episode stems from the importance of what he's about to highlight. At the end of the agreement, Faisal took it upon himself to write out in his own handwriting an addendum to the document that he signed. In Cooper's own words, quote, "This note that Faisal put on was handwritten by Faisal himself and signed by him, and the handwritten note read, quote, 'But if by the slightest modification or departure were to be made, I shall not then be bound by a single word of the present agreement which shall be deemed void and of no account or validity, and I shall not be answerable in any way whatsoever.'" End quote. Cooper emphasizes that he views this line as highly significant. He argues it reflects a cultural code of honor where any breach would cause deep personal disgrace, a stain on Faisal's character, and that this concept of reputation and honor was central not only to Faisal but to broader Arab cultural values of the time. As Cooper puts it himself, quote, "His purpose in writing that note was much more personal. The important part of that note is the last line. If the agreement's breached, I shall not be answerable in any way whatsoever." Faisal wanted to establish in no uncertain terms that if the agreement was breached, his honor was not to be questioned. End quote. Cooper continues, quote, "To Faisal, this was not a formality. Arguably, to Faisal, this was the most important part of the agreement. And to understand why, you first have to understand that the very idea of typing out and signing a contract was almost completely foreign to someone like Faisal. Whereas the British and the Zionists were kind of amused by Faisal's primitive obsession with personal honor, he considered it even more primitive that these men required records and contracts at all, that these men weren't able to just make agreements based on their word and their reputation." End quote. Cooper places great weight on this note and its connection to Faisal's sense of honor. But there's a major issue. He omits the first part of the note. Here are two English translations of Faisal's full statement. The first is from T.E. Lawrence and reads, quote, "If the Arabs are established as I have asked in my manifesto of January 4th, addressed to the British Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, I will carry out what is written in this agreement. If changes are made, I cannot be answerable for failing to carry out this agreement." End quote. A second translation comes from Professor Philip Heaty. Quote, "Provided the Arabs obtain their independence as demanded in my memorandum dated 4th of January 1919 to the Foreign Office of the Government of Great Britain, I shall concur in the above articles, but if the slightest modification or departure were to be made, I shall not then be bound by a single word of the present agreement, which shall be deemed void and of no account or validity, and I shall not be answerable in any way whatsoever." End quote. The memorandum that Faisal is referring to here is his submission to the Paris Peace Conference that outlined Arab claims and contributions to the war effort. This entire first part of the quote about the Arabs getting their independence subject to the memorandum he previously submitted. Cooper leaves that part out, and I think it's clear why. Remember back in episode 1, when Cooper left out that part of the Belu founding charter, their manifesto, when they were talking about God and religion and intermingling that with their proto-Zionism. And then Cooper went on to say how that document demonstrates how religion wasn't at all a factor in Zionist ideology. Well, I think we're seeing a similar approach being taken here. By leaving out the first part of the note from the quotation, Cooper is leaving out some crucial context. With it included, it seems like this is much less about honor and much more about a transactional relationship. Faisal wanted his land. He wanted his kingdom. He wanted his influence, and if he didn't get it, why would he abide by the terms of his agreement with Weizmann if, after all, the entire point of it was for the Zionists to help him get Syria in his pocket? We're confronted once again by Cooper leaving out a core piece of a quote that, once fact-checked, completely alters the intention of the person giving it. We're seeing a pattern here. We're past the smelling smoke stage, we're in 5-alarm fire territory when it comes to quotations and their meaning. Cooper then takes us on a journey with Faisal. Now, just a heads up, this is a bit long and winding, but it's important that we go through this whole thing, so bear with me, okay? I think the payoff's going to be worth it. At least, I hope it is. Cooper tells us, quote, in his book, 7 Pillars of Wisdom, it's the book Lawrence wrote after the First World War, Lawrence tells us this famous story that begins with Faisal in Damascus. In the months just before his family raises its banners in rebellion against the Ottoman Empire, Faisal has come to Damascus to meet with Arab nationalist leaders that are allied with his family and are going to rise up with him once the rebellion begins. But his business with them has to be conducted in secret because the Ottoman secret police are all over the place. The secret police are under the command of the notoriously brutal Ottoman general Jamal Pasha, and they are ruthlessly rooting out any hint of Arab separatism because they know it's in the air. So, since the rebellion hasn't begun yet, Faisal's Hashemite clan is, still on paper, a prominent ally of the Ottoman Empire. Faisal is brought into Damascus by Jamal Pasha as a visiting dignitary, visiting nobleman, but he's kept under close watch. There are suspicions regarding his family's loyalty, but no proof, so Jamal Pasha just simply tries to keep an eye on Faisal while Faisal ducks and weaves around the city in secret meetings with his friends and allies. Now, whenever the secret police captured an Arab nationalist, Jamal Pasha would pull Faisal from whatever he was doing and he would force him to attend the public execution of this Arab. The condemned man had usually been brutally tortured by the time he's about to be hanged, and he bore all the signs of it, beatings and cuts and bruises and all this. As he's led out to be hanged, now very often these were men with whom Faisal had just recently met and who were incurring this damage and subsequent execution because they were allied to Faisal's family. Very often, these were some of his best friends, but Jamal Pasha already suspected Faisal's loyalty, so he would have his men watching very carefully for any reaction from Faisal or from the condemned man, both of whom had to go through this whole process very careful, never to make eye contact with each other or give any sign to indicate that they had any idea who the other person was. Faisal watched many dozens of his friends be tortured and killed in this way, and he would have faced the same fate if any of his captured allies had given Faisal up under torture, but not a single one ever did. Faisal only lost his cool one time during a hanging when he blurted out that Jamal Pasha's brutality was going to cost the Ottoman Empire everything it was trying to avoid, and it actually took intercessions from some of the Hashemites' high-ranking friends back in Istanbul, the capital of Turkey, to save Faisal's life. So, very often, after an Arab separatist was captured, tortured, and killed, Jamal Pasha would make Faisal come up to his chambers, and Faisal would have to sit there while Jamal Pasha ate his meal and drank his wine and threw a temper tantrum where he would scream at Faisal a bunch of abuse about Arabs, about how they were all dogs, all scum, and all just so forth, things like that. So Faisal would sit through this, night after night after night, watching his friends be executed and tortured again and again, and having to listen to this abuse from the person that's doing it, always looking for an opportunity to slip out for another meeting with his allies to plan this upcoming rebellion. End quote. Okay, so that was a lot to take in. Remember that all of this is coming from Cooper through Lawrence of Arabia, the guy who was absolutely obsessed with Faisal and the Arab cause in the war. So his recollection of events is obviously going to clearly slant in one direction. But in summary, here's what Cooper tells us. Faisal went to Damascus and met with Arab nationalists, and was then forced to watch them murdered and tortured before his very eyes repeatedly by Jamal Pasha, who, according to Cooper, went on a tirade against how evil Arabs are. So, for the most part, none of this happened. And the bits of truth that are included are twisted to the point that they're unrecognizable. We're going to be relying heavily on Ali Alawi here, the Iraqi historian we quoted from earlier. Again, this guy literally wrote the book on Faisal. So let's start at the beginning with Faisal's visit to Damascus. He visited the city a few times in the year leading up to the Arab revolt in June 1916. Alawi starts us off with his first visit during this time frame. Quote, Faisal arrived in Damascus on the 26th of March 1915 and stayed there for 4 weeks before proceeding to Istanbul. End quote. In this first visit, he was on his way to confront the Ottomans about the incriminating documents we discussed earlier, the ones that said he and his entire family should be killed. Yeah, those documents. Alawi continues to provide some context behind Faisal's time in Damascus. As Cooper mentions, there were Arab nationalists in the city at the time, and they were forming secret societies. They would meet and theorize about how Arabs could achieve more autonomy. Quote, the Bakri family, under their patriarch Ada Pasha al-Bari, were his hosts throughout this period. Earlier in the year, Fawzi al-Bakri, Ada Pasha's eldest son, had arrived in Mecca to serve out his period in the Ottoman army, on secondment to Sharif Hussein's personal guard. Fawzi had been briefed by the secret societies, as he had recently joined al-Fatah, about their plans for an Arab state in the event of the Ottoman Empire's incapacity or defeat, and to sound out Sharif Hussein's position if he were to lead this movement. The message that Fawzi carried was that senior figures in Syria and Iraq, including Arab offices in the Ottoman army, were planning for Arab independence in the event that the Ottoman state was not able to effectively freeform itself in a manner that would prevent foreigners from seizing the opportunity to occupy and colonize these Arab lands. Hussein was asked to either receive a delegation from the secret societies or to send a trusted representative to meet with them in Damascus. End quote. Okay, so nothing so far that really diverges from Cooper's telling. We have a representative from the Arab nationalists telling Hussein, Faisal's father, to send someone to Damascus, and Faisal fits neatly into that role. Alawi then tells us about Faisal's time in Damascus during this first visit when he met with some of these secret societies. Quote, at first, the leaders of al-Fatah were hesitant about confiding their inner secrets to Faisal, especially as his pro-Turkish leanings were well known. In time, however, mutual trust began to grow, as Faisal explained to them that his pro-Turkish position was more to do with his fear that European powers would come to dominate Arab lands if the Ottoman Empire was further weakened or fell. They briefed him in detail about their organization and plans, especially after Faisal had indicated that he would accept membership of al-Fatah. End quote. Alawi continues, referring to a 1933 interview Faisal gave in which he quotes him directly. Quote, at Damascus, I met a great number of intellectuals, among whom were Bedouin, notables of Damascus, Syrian ulem, and officers of an Arab division belonging to the Syrian Army Corps. One of the chiefs of staffs was Yassin Pasha, the present Minister of Finance of Iraq. They all assured me that they were prepared to start the revolution and begged me to raise the standard of revolt. I replied that I was only charged by my father to study the situation in Syria and the general aspect of affairs of Constantinople. and that without support of some powerful organization or of one of the great powers, I could not accept the responsibility of a revolution, and also that I must go to Constantinople and return by Syria to Mecca to report progress to my father." End quote. Faisal then left Damascus for Istanbul in April 1915, where he is received as a visiting dignitary with full honors and holds meetings with two of the three ruling pashas. According to Alawi, Faisal departed Istanbul and returned to Damascus for a second visit in May 1915, during which he met Jamal Pasha. Cooper claims that it's at this point that Jamal delivered an anti-Arab tirade in front of Faisal and executed Faisal's friends in his presence. Faisal and Jamal subsequently traveled to Jerusalem and the Sinai to visit the Ottoman Fourth Army and inspect its defenses against the British. Faisal then returns for a third time and final time before the revolt. As Alawi says, quote, "Upon his return to Damascus from the visit to the Sinai front and Jerusalem, Faisal once again stayed in the Bakri house. Visitors and emissaries from the secret societies continued to pour in. During his absence in Istanbul, Al-Ad and Al-Fatah leaders had drafted a protocol setting out the terms and conditions for their cooperation with Britain in the war against the Ottoman Empire. Faisal was asked to carry the statement to his father in Mecca and establish whether the protocol could form the basis of a concerted plan of action with the British. This was the first clear statement regarding the conditions set out by the secret societies for entering the war on the side of the Allies. It explicitly defined the meaning of an Arab state." End quote. So far, so good, given Cooper's recounting. Faisal is in Damascus again, meeting with members of these secret societies who are plotting against the Ottomans. But things start to go off the rails here. Faisal himself recounted this third visit to Damascus in May 1915 when he said in a later interview, quote, "In Syria, I found that the situation was extremely critical. All those whom I met begged me to enter into an agreement with the heads of the movement in order to discuss what was the best way to start freeing the country." End quote. Do you see anything in there recounting being scolded in person by one of the three leaders of the Ottoman Empire? Anything about being brought in front of members of the secret societies and having them tortured or murdered in front of his own eyes? Anything about those being killed avoiding eye contact with Faisal? You would think that if Faisal was brought in front of Arab nationalists who were slaughtered in front of him, that would have left a lasting impression and probably would have been worth mentioning, but he doesn't do so. And there's a very good reason for that. Now, to be clear, in April-May 1915, there are arrests happening in Damascus. Jamal Pasha does catch wind of the Arab nationalist groups, and some of these people were executed in August 1915. Another wave of arrests occurred in Lebanon and Syria in the fall of 1915, and some of those people incarcerated were also executed in Beirut and Damascus. But, according to Alawi, Faisal returned to Mecca in June 1915 and remained there for 6 months. So these executions were happening while Faisal wasn't even in Damascus. He was back in the Hejaz. Given this timeline, Faisal was nowhere near these executions. He was back in the Arabian Peninsula. So if Alawi, the guy who literally wrote the book on Faisal, if his timeline is correct, where is Cooper getting this from? None of this lines up. Faisal didn't even see these executions, and that also means that dressing down from Jamal doesn't seem like that happened either. The other thing that's odd about this is that Jamal Pasha didn't inherently hate Arabs. According to Alawi, quote, "Jamal was one of the few CUP leaders who was a dedicated pan-Islamist, and was not known for any Turkish supremacist tendencies. His arrival in Syria was met with celebrations and festivities in all the main cities that he passed through. In his memoirs, he wrote of the people of Syria, 'All the people of the land that I passed through were highly patriotic and loyal to the Ottoman cause. I was filled with joy when I saw and felt that the majority of the Arabs will not stop in sacrificing their all in this great war to liberate the Islamic Caliphate.'" End quote. So, yes, Jamal Pasha did execute several members of secret Arab nationalist societies in Syria who were suspected of plotting rebellion. But the idea that he launched into a broad racist tirade against Arabs in front of Faisal, who, again, wasn't even in Damascus at the time Cooper places this alleged interaction, runs contrary to what we know about Jamal's outlook on the empire and its subjects. In his memoir, Memoirs of a Turkish Statesman, 1913 to 1919, Jamal criticizes Arab nationalists for undermining Ottoman unity, but his condemnation is political, not ethnic. There's no evidence that his opposition to separatism extended to a blanket hatred of Arabs. In short, much of this appears to be dramatic storytelling rather than history. The timeline doesn't hold up, and neither does the alleged rebuke of Faisal. That much should be evident from everything we've just gone through. So the question becomes, why frame Faisal this way? Why go through such lengths to portray him as deeply wronged, as a noble and honorable figure? What's the purpose behind that narrative choice? Well, I think the answer is fairly clear. Cooper is falling into the same trap that T.E. Lawrence did, romanticizing Faisal. All signs point to the fact that he wants Faisal to be the hero of the story, so he casts him in that role. He needs Faisal to be betrayed, to be the victim, so he builds a narrative with that as his North Star. I mean, Cooper even says that Faisal and the Arab way of life strikes a nerve. He tells us, quote, "These values are romantic to Westerners like Lawrence precisely because they seem to reflect something that we've lost in modern society." A lot of people like to say that nothing was lost because none of this honor stuff, none of it ever existed. It was all just stories. I don't think so, okay? I don't think so. Men like Lawrence didn't think so, and that's why they were so fascinated by what they found out in that desert. End quote. It feels like Cooper, just like Lawrence, has been drinking a bit too much cactus juice. In Cooper's telling, there's no mention of the fact that Faisal breached his agreement with the French, an agreement made in January 1920 to avoid taking any unilateral actions in Syria. And yet, what does he do? He accepts the kingship of Syria, fully aware of the consequences. His brother Abdullah avoided making that same mistake, chose to cooperate more closely with the British, and things worked out far better for him. Instead, we're presented with this muddled narrative, something like a hall of mirrors where Faisal is blameless. I said this in an earlier episode. The British weren't guiltless. Sykes-Picot, the negotiation and documents that the French and British established, did clash with Arab claims, especially in Syria, but the depiction of Faisal as nothing but virtuous and noble misses the mark. The Hashemites walked away from the war with more than they started with. They directly benefited from their alliance with the British in the First World War, and if Faisal had played his hand more carefully, they might have ended up with Syria too. But even after the French had kicked Faisal out, the British handed him another throne in Iraq. So they still came out with all of this, with 3 countries under their umbrella. We'll close this part of the story out with this. I think another part of the motivation here on Cooper's end is to make Faisal and the Hashemites seem aggrieved so that the British and the Israelis take the fall for most of the blame in the lead up to war. Anyways, let's continue. We then move on to the sociological analysis of societies where Cooper really tries to hone in on how societies are built and how they progress. His position is that in early societies, reputation, trust, and honor are pivotal to the functioning of society. When you don't have institutions like the police or the courts or dispute resolution mechanisms, your reputation is incredibly important. Trust is important, and that as societies develop, these institutions grow. Your reputation and sense of honor become less and less material to your day-to-day life. He uses an example, which I think is pretty accurate, actually. That you can walk into a store today, anywhere, and buy something, be it a hamburger or a television, and no one's going to care about your reputation when you do so. A Target or Walmart isn't going to throw someone out because they had an unsavory history. If you have money to pay, they'll take it. But his point is that the character of people that you did business with in the past. That was important, especially in societies that produced men like Faisal, where people were more self-governing than not. There was, of course, the central authority in the form of the Ottomans, but the fact was that much of the empire, as we've covered, was delegated to locals to administer and run. There was a lot of self-governance, and so who you knew and how you acted were important. Trust and reliability was important. This isn't just something unique to the Arabian Peninsula. This is the case in all earlier societies, and so I agree with Cooper on the thrust of his point here. He expands on this in the following terms, quote, "There's a reason that this is an almost universal Golden Age myth in civilization throughout history, and all over the world. It's because they all have this sense that they gave something up. Maybe they don't know what it is, but it's this idea that they lost something, and something has been lost in most cases." End quote. It's this notion that, sure, we've benefited from the internet, and credit cards, and GPS in our cars, but that at the same time, the personal relationships that fundamentally connected us outside of the screens and the phones, all of that has been deprioritized in importance to a degree. The importance of human relationships, and the trust and honor that was previously associated with them, has been deprioritized by technology and institutional development. Cooper's position is that this is the natural progress of most societies as they develop, and that nothing can be done to stop it, and that the trust that we previously placed in each other now has to be placed in institutions. He expands on this in the following, quote, "It's not just that you can go to the state institutions. Now you have to go to state institutions. If someone attacks your sister, you might want to tear that guy's head off, and normally you would do that, but now you can't. Now you have to go to the police." End quote. He's making the point that in order for the system to work, we have to take the trust we put in honor-bound relationships previously, something that our forebears did, and now put it in the state. Cooper emphasizes how, in the West, we still have the fumes of these tribal honor-bound societies in our midst. He refers to the underworld and the illicit drug trade as an example, where you can't appeal to the authorities or the state for intervention, where relationships and honor do still matter, and where disrespect can result in vigilantism and death. He goes on to explain to us how the state is essentially a series of magnets and institutions, and how these institutions have different levels of coverage in different areas, and in some places where there's low institutional coverage, the state doesn't attract as much authority. Think of somewhere like the hinterlands of Siberia, or in the far-flung rural areas of one of the countries that ends in Stan. On a map, these areas obviously belong to a country, but in practice, the rigor of state authority ebbs and flows in these regions. Cooper defines the state outright as, quote, "not the buildings and the offices and the titles and any of that. It's not anything, okay? The state is the network of institutions that mediate and standardize the relationships and exchanges between individuals." End quote. And so we spend all of this time focusing on what is a state, how do states evolve, and how societies operate, and honestly, there isn't much here in this analysis that I think is off the mark. Societies are certainly more grounded in relationships early on, and as they develop, these relationships and their dynamics evolve along with the institutions of the state, and that we have to trust these institutions in order for society to function. And if they don't function, or if we don't put our trust in them, we're forced to resort to a more tribal way of life that we see in the underworld today. To contrast the way we deal with conflict today in society with how things used to work, Cooper goes on a rant that left me absolutely stunned. I'm not going to hype this up further to tease you, we're just going to jump right into this. Quote, "In Homer's Iliad, right, the Achaeans go to war and destroy the city of Troy because the prince of Troy ran off with the Spartan king Menelaus' wife Helen. A whole city and people was destroyed to avenge that insult. Well, if Helen had been in a burqa, that probably wouldn't have happened." End quote. Yes, Cooper actually says this. I am quoting verbatim from the episode. I assure you, this is real. If you're sitting there with your mouth open, or your head in your hands, or you're laughing to yourself, you aren't alone. So here again, similar to his lionization of Faisal, he's engaging in some Orientalist supremacy in an attempt to contrast dispute resolution in the past with how we deal with disputes in society today. But the manner in which he does this is pretty egregious, obviously. He's mocking one of the pivotal mythological tales of the West, and doing so in a way that portrays the traditions of the East as superior. Troy wouldn't have been destroyed if Helen was wearing a burqa. But wait, there's even more. Quote, so most people think about the sequestration of women or female dress codes like the burqa as being rooted in the Muslim religion, right? Or, to take the most extreme example, they consider something like honor killing, where a girl is killed by her family members because of some real or imagined unapproved sexual relationship, to be about the Muslim religion, or at least about religion, since honor killings occasionally happen in other groups as well, other religious groups occasionally. But all of these things existed before Islam ever came around, okay? The Prophet Muhammad didn't invent the burqa. He didn't invent honor killing or any of that. These behaviors existed before it came around. They're rooted in tribal society arrangements where, as ugly as they are, and believe me, they're as ugly to me as anybody, they had a purpose at one time. It's not a justification to say that something has a purpose, and I'm not interested in having pointless conversations about whether things like this are justified. It's not about that. See, very often, even the most oppressive laws laid down by a new religion are a moral step forward at the time. That's something that's really hard for a lot of people to grasp, end quote. So we've jumped from preventing the Trojan War by imagining Helen in a burqa, thereby injecting a totally foreign custom into a completely unrelated mythological conflict, to playing defense for things like honor killings, and excusing them by saying, well, other people do this too, and that honor killings were a moral step forward, as if that's somehow relevant to dispute resolution today in any capacity. He attempts to justify all of this with the following, quote, it was an attempt by these people in the absence of all that. It was an attempt by these people to get together and come to some kind of an arrangement where there were commonly agreed upon penalties for violations so that they could stop getting into these full-fledged multi-generational blood feuds every time a crime happens. At the time, it was a step forward. It was an attempt to answer a pressing social question in the absence of established social institutions, end quote. I mean, sure. Yeah, that does make sense. If he had just talked about honor killings in isolation as a historical mechanism for resolving disputes, I think that train of thought might hold more credibility. Tribal societies come up with different ways of regulating themselves that seem barbaric to us today. But when you combine all of this together, placing Faisal on a pedestal and portraying him as blameless, the Trojan War burqa comment, the rationale for honor killings, we're seeing a pattern here that's hard to ignore. It's starting to feel like Cooper is acting contrary to what he told us in episode 1, when he said he wasn't going to tell us who's right or wrong in this conflict. You know, recently, before listening to this episode of Fear and Loathing in the New Jerusalem, I watched the movie Lawrence of Arabia, which tells the story of T.E. Lawrence during his time in the desert with Faisal and the Great Arab Revolt. There's this scene where Lawrence walks into British Army headquarters in Cairo, right up to the bar, wearing a regal Arabesque outfit with all the expected garb, and the officers around him recognize him and they're all staring and gawking at him like he's lost his damn mind. But Lawrence isn't fazed. He feels connected to the outfit, like he's found something in the desert that's become a part of him. It's unique. It's foreign. And frankly, it's a shiny bauble compared to the mundane. It gives him something, a sense of purpose. I can't help but think of Cooper when I reflect on this scene, given all of this commentary from him. As we move on, Cooper starts getting to what I think is the heart of the matter, and the real reason that he's taking us along this winding path on the origins of statehood, what it means, and how it develops. In relation to the institutions of the state that give it legitimacy, he tells us, quote, "Those institutions, they depend first and foremost on some level of common agreement. Without those agreements, there is no state. Or at least no legitimacy, okay? And without legitimacy, all you have is force, and you can only push that so far, okay? And those agreements, they depend more than anything on trust," end quote. He continues to say that societies are built out of, quote, "the series of networks which allow individuals to regulate their interactions with each other. And by the way, societies come apart when too many people become unable to find network jacks that they can kind of plug into, okay? That's something that we need to keep in mind. In our developed societies today, you can have all the state apparatus you want, but when too many people find themselves in those little blank spots, those areas with no coverage, find that they can't access broader society through the state institutions. Look out, okay? That's how societies come ripping apart," end quote. So he's laying the groundwork around how society as a whole is built on institutions that depend on trust and a degree of consensus, and that without this trust, the state essentially loses its legitimacy. As he puts it, when people can't plug into society, when they can't appeal to these institutions for daily needs or justice, they will turn on the state and its authority and question its legitimacy. This makes sense, right? If you live in a society where the government does nothing for its people, where people can't access courts, police, or systems of dispute resolution, the legitimacy of the state will suffer. I'm with Cooper so far. But then he gets to what I think is the kill shot that signals what's coming next. He says, quote, "When there are no strong and legitimate states that hold a monopoly of violence and retain to themselves the final authority to render and enforce judgments, groups have no choice but to resort to what anthropologists who study this kind of thing, who study tribal culture, call self-help." Now, this has nothing to do with positive thinking or morning yoga routines, right? It just means that if you have a dispute with someone, it is on you to solve it, end quote. Now it feels like we're really getting into the meat of the issue. Remember, this is all centered around the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We were just taken through a fairly detailed breakdown of what constitutes a state, how states lose legitimacy, and how, when legitimacy is absent or never existed, people like to take matters into their own hands. That's when you get things like vigilante justice. If I had to guess where he's going with this, I think there's something a bit amorphous here relating to the lead-up to what Israelis call the War of Independence and Palestinians call the Nakba. Again, I haven't listened to the next episode yet, but it feels like the conclusion from Cooper is going to be something like this. Palestinian political leadership had no state-based institutions to turn to. They were betrayed by the British. The Zionists forced them into this position, and because of this, they were and are justified in using violence as a form of resistance against the Jews. At least, that's my prediction, but let's see if I'm right. I don't want to jump ahead of our timeline, but there are plenty of reasons why this framing, if it unfolds in the way I'm predicting, is a gross oversimplification. Not to spoil anything, but we've already covered how Jews were, for the most part, mistreated both in the Middle East and in Europe. As a persecuted minority, nowhere was ideal. Eventually, they decided to return to the land from which they had been historically expelled, because between Europe and the Middle East, there really wasn't anywhere they could thrive. There's a grand irony in this. If Jews had been accepted by their home countries in the centuries after their expulsion from Judea, it's unlikely that Israel would have come to exist in its current modern form. Persecution was the crucible in which Zionism was born, as we discussed in episode 1. But yeah, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves here. We have a timeline that we need to stick to, after all. Well, that's my sense as to where Cooper's going with this. You know, that he's going to use all this talk of honor and statehood to buttress Palestinian grievances in the lead up to war and into the present day. I feel like he really sets us up for that by saying the following near the end of this episode, quote, "If you're being exploited and humiliated and colonized by outside powers, The only hope you have of changing that situation is finding some way, any way, to unite some common ground. Unite on that so you can meet other nation-states on an even playing field. So when the usual secular political identities are all illegitimate, what are you going to do? You're going to find something else, and in the Middle East, that something else has been religion. End quote. I find this quote pretty remarkable for two reasons. The first is that it's simply not accurate. Some of the major nation-states and groups in the Middle East that would come to blows with the Israelis were notoriously secular. Top of mind, I'm thinking of the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, a terrorist organization that has previously conducted airplane hijackings and suicide bombings, and they are very much Marxist and very much not religious. Hell, I mean, even Jamal Abdel Nasser, the leader of Egypt and the champion of the pan-Arabist movement in the post-war Middle East, was notoriously secular. There's even footage of him mocking the Muslim Brotherhood's suggestion that all Egyptian women should be required to wear head coverings. So the idea that religion was the primary basis of unification seems rather myopic. Was it a factor, and was it weaponized by Arab leaders to rally people? Absolutely. But these movements, while sometimes drawing on a religion, were not in many cases religious in nature. The second reason that this quote is so remarkable is because it directly contradicts what Cooper says in the first episode of Fear and Loathing in the New Jerusalem. Remember back in episode 1, when Cooper poorly quotes from the Bilu Manifesto, that proto-Zionist pioneering group? He omits a portion that invokes God and religion because he's trying to argue that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict isn't a religious conflict but a political one. In episode 1, he told us, quote, "This was and always was a political conflict with definite causes and specific grievances." End quote. He really tried to drive home that this wasn't a conflict rooted in religion. He even says that people try to obscure the real causes by injecting religion into the narrative, making it seem timeless and unresolvable, whereas political conflicts, in contrast, can be negotiated and concluded. That was the main thrust of his argument, or at least how I interpreted it. And yet here Cooper is, just a couple episodes later, infusing religion into the conflict. He's telling us that religion is intrinsic to it, that it was the method by which Arabs unified in the face of what they perceived as colonial aggression. So which is it? Is this a religiously fueled political conflict, a purely political conflict, or something else entirely? This feels like a flagrant contradiction of what he spent a great deal of time insisting on not long ago. It just feels inconsistent. And so in conclusion, we're still orbiting around the early 1920s, but I expect that to change very soon. We're seeing the continuation of a trend that we started picking up on in episode 1. We were told from the outset we were going to get an honest broker, a neutral telling of the history, a deep dive into the facts on the ground that would let us make up our own minds. But when you pick at this a little, and honestly not that much picking is needed, we see a lot of things here start to unravel. From Faisal's travel itineraries and his agreement with Weizmann to the contradictory characterization of this conflict as only political in nature. We'll continue our critique of Fear and Loathing in the New Jerusalem next time, and we'll keep holding those making extraordinary claims accountable to the historical record. That brings us to the end of episode 4 of Crackpot History. If you enjoyed listening to this episode, feel free to share it with someone that you think would get something out of it as well. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time.